Welcome back to The World is Weird and Crazy. We're going to lay it down with Layman Pascal yet again. Continuing our discussion of anti-intellectualism, but going to try to level up, and we're transitioning into another topic next week. So I want to talk a little bit about this article I published, Anti-Intellectualism in American Strife Instead of Life, from post-truth to paradigm shift. So we have a long way to go to close that gap. And as I said to you before in my article, it's just a small step in that direction. The article is, mostly about the nature of anti-intellectualism. And of course, the background context is this post-truth era that we live in, which is not reducible to Trump, but he's definitely a figurehead of that. He's the face of willful stupidity, if you will. And we're keeping it deep, though. The crisis is way below the surface, the meta crisis. So we had two good conversations about anti-intellectualism. And, I'm just hoping this article helps us build off that and take it in new directions. I had a lot of trouble organizing the material for a long time. That's why it took me so long. But I decided to, start off with this prologue about think tanks, because, I sort of run a pataphysical think tank, and I work with other think tanks like Perspectiva. And, we're all aware to a large extent of the biases and partisanship and shortcomings of different established think tanks, right? Whether it's Cato Institute or Brookings Institute, or the more fringe yet very powerful ones like the Heartland Institute. They fund climate denial, and the list goes on. So we're trying to understand that problem, and this author Thomas Medved's kind of really splits it down the middle, and finds anti-intellectualism even in that culture. And so that's what I've been picking up on for a long time. And of course it's widespread, and it's within ourselves, and we all have a kind of capacity to be intellectual and anti-intellectual at the same time. So I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts on all that and just continuing the dialogue.
Yeah, great to be here. Always open to chatting with an autonomous sociologist confined to the margins.
don't forget relegated.
Relegated
Autonomous sociologist. That's the key word from Medved's there.
Subtle forms and sometimes counterintuitive forms of anti-intellectualism, the willfulness of willful ignorance, and the recent Harper's article and the different sides of that thing. I'm looking forward to getting into all of that. I would like to say, though, the last couple of videos, when I see the link, there's this picture of you, straight mouth, looking all serious. And there's always a picture of me, my mouth's half open, you're three teeth showing. How does it always catch me in that moment?
YouTube has given me three options, and I'm picking the best one, believe it or not.
Oh my
God. That's the truth. But if I go the extra step, I could upload a custom thumbnail. I haven't done that yet, though. I'm just going off what YouTube gives me.
I would love to start with the willfulness thing. You mentioned Trump as the poster boy for willful ignorance. And the interesting thing about the willful ignorance is there's a quasi-voluntary element in it, which means that the people doing it feel like there's something in it for them, right? And that something could be the maintenance of a system in which they're embedded, or it could be something more personal, and I think this is traditionally endemic to the American version, the sense that you might get a superpower by being a dummy, right? That if you watch almost any American superhero movie, there's this crisis where a person loses their access to their powers, and they get it back by a combination of emoting, not thinking, and going rogue. So there's this promise that makes sense in some ways and doesn't make sense in other ways. The way it doesn't make sense is sort of the Dunning-Kruger thing, where if you're on the edge of the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you slip back into it, you actually feel good. You suddenly are evaluating yourself very positively as being super smart and competent, and that's a nice spot to be in. Why not choose the evaluation that gives you the most positive feeling, gives you the swelled head? So that's bad. But the good form is, in a way, if you live in a system where intellectual training isn't very strong, or where there's no real wisdom around how to contact your conscious and unconscious, your thoughtful and your instinctive, your fast and slow minds, no wisdom about how to put those together. If that's a bankrupt system that you live in, then by all means, maybe you should fall back on your automatic reactions if you live in a corrupt thought zone. So that might be the way to go. And I think sometimes the American system has diagnosed itself as being intellectually insufficient, and therefore decided that its chance to be a powerful, competent person who makes the good decisions in the world is to use very basic instinctive heuristics instead of reasoning.
Yeah, it's there's so much going on there. It's easy to issue responsibility for these things because responsibility is so distributed, right? Even if you're the president, one day you can say, well, I have all the power and I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to pardon Roger Stone, right? Which happened recently. But you can also say, and it's true, you can say, well, I have no real power. I'm checked by Congress, and I'm just a figurehead and all these sorts of things. So, not my problem. And yeah, if you're a business leader, especially, you can kind of like benefit off the hard work of other people, and just you weaponize your intelligence, something we talked about before. And in particular, this phrase, unreflective instrumentalism, it's just not self-critical. And I think, in the case of Trump, or even George Bush, who, by comparison is a hell of a lot smarter, the research suggests, and other research that I haven't cited yet, but that this is on purpose. It's easy to think and like look at Bushisms and misspeaking and think, oh, that guy's an idiot, but it's all on purpose. It's all theater, because of course they're intelligent and in some ways intellectual, and they're surrounded by teams of other intelligent and intellectual people. But one thing that's really pertinent here with this paradigm shift is like there's a difference between people who are kind of inside the old system and people who are outside that and kind of inside the new system, right? Like us and the people we work with. And we see the anti-intellectual pattern there, which is things like making compromises and shortcuts, like with whether it's heuristics or another kind of shortcut. And that this is what helps reproduce the meta crisis, right? So it's not just hostility towards intellectuals, but actually ignoring what is disruptive to your worldview, right? So it comes back to very basic psychological pathologies like cognitive dissonance, and the whole basket of fallacies. There's at least like 250 that are pretty specific. So what I like about what I did with this article here is, in the kind of most not hasty, but I tried to be efficient. I tried to make a meta move on Hofstadter, because Hofstadter's work is great, as we've talked about, but the problem is so much deeper. We live in an anti-intellectual culture, and that's reinforced. It's overdetermined by so many factors, and so that's brought us to the brink of post-truth, and a lot of commentary and punditry and political action just continues the same old trajectory, the same old status quo. And it takes a kind of hyper intellectualism with a hyper heart and compassion to reconcile that and reverse that trend?
In general, do you think the solution to an overdetermined situation has to also be overdetermined? Or do you think there's like a central pillar that can be knocked out and bring it all down?
Yeah, like, there's this fear of, the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction, right? So you go from capitalism to communism, and that's just its antithesis or whatever, and then, that just doesn't work. But I do like the idea of over determining the solution, in the sense of, like, if you just you educate everybody, you give everyone a universal basic income, like, what's the worst that could happen, right? You have some various kinds of surpluses, and there's a huge fear to this, because the status quo and assumptions about human nature has always been that there's no limits to what elites can have in terms of wealth and power, but the masses, by and large, need to be limited, right? So they have just the logic of markets makes it so not only do they have a kind of ceiling, like a kind of maximum wage, just by a de facto maximum wage, they don't even have a minimum wage, right? So there's just this there's no bottom, and so we all fall out of it. So this would be a whole other conversation, I think, but I think it's a great idea to kind of over determine the solution, right? Once we understand how the problems are over determined, right? Like, just think of like prohibition or something. Like, there's also this term nexus causality. There's just so many causes to the same particular manifestations, right? Whether it's homelessness or poverty, we need to over determine the solutions. And I think metamodernism and Hansi's work go in these directions, because they make sure that the interlocking system that we're trying to build has no holes. Like, it's not a leaky abstraction. It finds a way to be a closed loop and contain all the externalities and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, I would think at the very least you have to have a confluence of um, good developmental intellectual practices in the educational system, a philosophy that backs that up, and all the supportive life conditions that give people the physical capacity and the time and space and energy to pursue those things.
Yeah, and yeah, UBI is a good example, because I think there's a concern, and I suppose this has some salience in the Scandinavian countries, but there's a concern, if you just give people money, that they become lazy and apathetic. But there's ways to counter that. You know, and I think education is part of that. Like, if people can find meaning through helping the world, then there's no limit to that.
As long as they have the capacity and are
Right.
polarized into some kind of developmental meaning structure, there shouldn't be too much of a problem there. But the way you lay out the system has to be such that it incentivizes people to pursue meaningful activity. Otherwise, they're just, if you imagine it as them simply getting bonus resources within the current system layout, yeah, they're going to fall out of the current system layout. Absolutely. That's why you need a different
Yeah.
system layout.
Yeah, like, if there wasn't so much opposition in the world, right? Like I find meaning and a sort of functionality in speaking up for progressive politics and challenging these other so-called intellectual communities, like the intellectual dark web. Like, if they didn't exist, my job would be a lot easier. But it would still be hard. It would just sort of shift the goalposts in the other direction. Like, I would, then we'd be able to focus more and collectively on the real meta issues, right? Things like climate change and economic collapse. So what we've seen in the culture, especially the past 4 years, but beyond, is just more superficial conflicts that really distracts us from that deeper stuff. And maybe you know, different parties involved think they have a claim in their complaint. They think they have a claim to the deeper issue, you know, like they're all maybe connected to economics, you know, some in some way, but to varying degrees. You know, we need to um we need to shift that frame. It seems impossible, especially in hindsight. You know, all the people who were against Bernie can be like, well, I told you so. But this is anti-intellectual. This is part of what I'm trying to demonstrate and establish, and especially with how it links up into metanoia, because with metanoia you realize what was wrong, and then it changes your experience of the past, right? So you no longer experience your own past experience in the same way, right? It changes your past, present, and future, changes yourself and world. And so, you know, for in order for this transformation to occur, we need to individually and collectively keep revising, you know, and you know, revisionist um, practice of our history, so we recognize the wrongdoing. And so, you know, case in point, in this century, is things like the Iraq War, the War on Terror, and you know, how do people who were for that come to terms with the fact that they were wrong, you know, absolutely wrong, because many people still haven't. And then, of course, and more recently with you know, the 2016 election and then 2020, I saw specific people, not a lot, but specific people. And I think I've mentioned them before, you know, like Peter Dow is one character, and more recently a podcaster named Ryan Knight. They've been very explicit and self-conscious and just vocal about their own transformation, about how they went from kind of establishment Democrat to radical socialist, leftist, right? And so for them, it was a healthy transition. They are able to be apologetic about it and to help others on that path. And so, you know, we need more voices like that until it reaches tipping points. But the key, though, is, you know, going back to what I was saying, is realizing your past mistakes, and you know, taking responsibility, but also, you know, rightly so, blaming the system for for manipulating you, because we're all kind of trapped by it.
Contradiction has a really interesting role because, on the one hand, it's the key to moral and political self-inquiry and transformation. On the other hand, it's the key to analyzing the subtler forms of anti-intellectualism, especially in those situations like you mentioned at the beginning of your article, where the complaint of anti-intellectualism can move from both sides, right? It can be the complaint of one group of intellectuals against another, trying to undermine them. It can be the complaint of one group of anti-intellectuals against another group of anti-intellectuals. So you very often find it coming from both sides, which is what happens with this attempt by the Harper's Corporation to co-opt the IDW role of championing free speech against cancel culture, because cancel culture, insofar as it actually exists, has a very strong and obvious anti-intellectual streak to it. But the quasi-genuine and often highly muddled free speech defenses against cancel culture, they have a streak of anti-intellectualism in them as well. And it's very hard to see what the process is unless you see it coming from both sides in the same event.
Yeah. And you know, I don't want to be like reductionist or just kind of overly simplistic and overgeneralizing here, but I think a lot of these editors of these big magazines, they become, you know, bourgeois liberals, and they become insulated, and they become kind of, for lack of a better word, compromised by the networks of discourse that they're in, right? So if you're in the New York Times or Harper's or whatever, you know, you just kind of get pressured, for lack of a better word, you know, back into a lot of a discourse with a lot of assumptions, right? And so it's the good leftists outside of that that are remaining critical, but there's a huge conversational gap between them, right? And so this letter controversy is a good example. I mean, we can all make the basic critique that the profit motive behind these publications and media conglomerates, you know, distorts their thinking, and individuals, right? But that itself is not obvious to each individual, right? You really have to drill down into your own ideology. So the point I'm making is just, you know, when things like this letter thing happen, right? Even if, you know, Noam Chomsky signs on, there's so many bad actors, right? Like provably bad actors who are signed on. It just comes off as tone deaf, right? And there's so many voices excluded. It's just, you know, it's a great idea, but it's hypocritical on the face of it, because it's saying, oh, we're all for free speech and let's debate the issues. But then there's no debate of those issues. There's no channels, there's no means to that meta conversation that we're trying to have, right? And again, the IDW is case in point. And what we're seeing recently with the letter, and also just Matt Taibbi's take on cancel culture and things like this, is another bifurcation, unfortunately, of the left, right? And you know, I follow a lot of great accounts on Twitter that can frame it better than I can. You know, and so I just want to read some. There's a couple great quotes or great threads. So just to read the top line of both, and this is from an anonymous account called Z Squirrel, ZEI_squirrel. Here's one. So the Iglesias, Fong, Jelani, contrarian, liberal, anti-woke crowd are just the other side of the coin of the performatively woke, liberal, Bakari Sellers, Roxanne Gay, Zerlina Maxwell crowd. Their intra-liberal woke wars are pure spectacle. They're all just law and order Biden Democrats. And I think that's that nails a lot of points that you know, and you know, there's a schism here, but ultimately you can take a step back and have a meta perspective and say, well, they're just kind of arguing in the center. They're kind of still status quo loyalists to varying degrees, compared to the radical change kind of unsung majority are actually advocating for.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, a lot of those guys like Jelani, they have some excellent systemic critiques, but I think people in general are still caught in this thing that I've been talking lately about in terms of progressives needing to differentiate themselves from liberals or even from the left, right? It doesn't matter what the terminology is, but there's some kind of, it's a schism insofar as people aren't in a very stable way able to see that distinction in themselves, to make that little, it's a shift that looks very small. And because it looks very small, it gets confused in this area where you're very much encouraged to feel like you're on one side of the conventional political spectrum. And maybe you have to work with that side. Maybe one side in a given situation gives you the leverage you need. But there's a sort of self-awakening of people who actually are in a different category and haven't substantially morally noticed that they're in a fundamentally different category. And I think a lot of that kind of awakening, sort of analogous to people who have a particular ethnicity or race, realizing that they do as they grow up, and that it plays a role in how they interact in society, because you don't notice that when you're 5 necessarily.
Right.
There comes a point, David Hartfeld Jr. talks about this really well, there's these stages of self-recognition. And I think there needs to be something more like a progressive self-recognition of the distinction between themselves and conventional left, and even the so-called extreme left or extremist liberals. More of the standard political spectrum is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a whole different kind of thing that would have its own spectrum, perhaps.
Yeah. let me see if I can find it. There's a it's going to take me a while to find, but there's a great kind of image of the old political spectrum, um, where, you know, just left to right, it's kind of uniform, and, you know, Bernie's on the left and Biden's in the center and Trump's on the right, and there's lots of other people in between. But then the new political spectrum, and this dovetails with what's called fishhook theory, but the new political spectrum, it says reality and it's slanted, and everyone's falling to the right, and then it's like got Bernie is still on the left, but that's described as the center, and then there's a kind of dotted line box to the left of that that says like watch this space. Right. And you know, I just think it's really salient. And I saw a reactionary person the other day trying to debunk it. You know, they're just resisting what it was trying to say, but I think it's really salient because there's something new emerging, and it's going through the left. Right? And so we need to be clear about what that is, and that's what these kind of epistemic culture wars are really about. And just to double down on this point, there's another thread here by this Twitter account. Both liberal wokeness and liberal anti-wokeness are lucrative grifts for aspiring media class types. So they're invested in maintaining the facade that they're actually battling over core principles, that they're engaged in some heroic war, but they're just jockeying for positions. And, you know, it comes back to this idea of, you know, employment security. Like, we all deserve our jobs, but so you have people like David Brooks whining about being threatened to be canceled, but like other people don't even have jobs, right? So there's just no sense of proportionality. And there's definitely writers who can do a better job than some of the main, you know, successful writers out there. And what it speaks to is I've seen this take articulated is that it's you know, fundamentally it means not just to protect those establishment writers and hacks, but, you know, so when something like this happens, there's an ultimate kind of cause that it relates to, right? And that's, in this case, it's workers' rights, it's job guarantee, it's universal basic income. Those things are the solution to these problems for everybody. But a lot of these people arguing and kind of fake debating are, you know, they believe in incrementalism, they believe in meritocracy. So they're married to a bunch of these myths that, you know, have a little bit of truth, but are continuing to hurt us.
It's a very hard argument to make against incrementalism because it's very easy to point to incremental improvements, but it's much more subtle, much more abstract to try to point out what status quo is maintained through and behind all of those incremental shifts. And there's like you mentioned, this half a filled in triangle. It's important, I think, for there to be more artifacts that provoke that kind of thinking. And then similarly, this Harper's letter is a cultural artifact, but what does it stand for? And what, you know, it's half of what system? I know there's a lot of people in there who one might like. You know, Chomsky has some terrific takes on things. I really liked him. He defended these Holocaust deniers years ago. And he said, free speech only means something if it defends something you hate. That's the only time it has a meaning, right? But I doubt that that's the position of the Harper's editorial board, right? They're not interested in what they hate. They're interested in maintaining a duopoly system in which oppositions are used to maintain a status quo. But they're also in a situation I think a lot of liberal intellectuals are in, which is in place of a self-reckoning, in place of examining their own contradictions, they slip into reviving traditional liberal idealism rhetoric or just checking in with their feelings. And I know last week I was making a lot of comments about how anti-emotionalism is often a cover for anti-intellectualism. But there's a flip side of that where the sort of pseudo-intellectual just shifts into checking their own feelings and values they've heard about. And that's their decoy for not really doing soul searching. You ask them to do a self-reckoning to check with their conscience, and what they do is tell you how they feel and what
Yeah.
virtues they've heard about, and then they go back to their regular functioning.
Yeah. This reminds me of a couple points in my article. One is just the idea of heuristics in general, you know, how we over rely on them. And of course, you know, integral theory is a great punching bag for that. And I didn't get into any specifics in my article precisely because I'd already critiqued a lot of these communities before, right? So the idea of the article is just to retroactively map back to those issues. But of course, you know, integral is famous for this. Like, oh, you're just red, like talking to green. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? You know, I get it, but those are really cognitive traps. And so the research suggests like the heuristics in general, and particularly the psychologism uh, notion. It's kind of a reductionism to psychology, and within that, the availability bias. These are the things that undo us, you know, and they're so obvious on one level, but you know, um, intellectuals even can fall for these traps, right? They'll fall back on what they studied for years, you know, what is all, you know, deeply research supported. And I think part of a metamodern or even postmodern insight is the undermining of a lot of that assuredness about research, right? And so, you know, well, what the data is telling us. And so there's that. And then also the things you're saying about the letter and cancel culture, like some of the more nuanced takes, but also can be seen as not so nuanced, as like nuanced. People are saying, you know, cancel culture is not actually real in the first place. So this whole discussion is just a distraction, and yeah, kind of, you know, holier than thou, finger pointing, he said, she said, because, you know, we can say in one sense there's been cancel culture for a long time. You know, leftist intellectuals have been canceled more, and you know, um, uh, uh, um, a parallel take is that the left is usually the free speech absolutists, right? Whereas the right is not; they're selective. So that's the irony here, right? Is the right intellectuals are ones that you know, are actually more prone to getting people canceled. They just have different tactics. But then there's this idea, like I said before, about proportionality. Like, what does it actually mean to get canceled? Like, so some people are whining that, you know, if they get attacked on Twitter, that means that they're canceled, right? And it's like there's no sense of proportionality there, because actual, you know, or, you know, some people are losing their jobs and stuff, but then, you know, the discourse doesn't really drill down deep enough to understand why it happened, right? There's a debate over like, oh, did they deserve it? Did they not deserve it? But, you know, as one of the examples I refer to in the article is like Alan Dershowitz versus Norman Finkelstein. And, you know, Alan Dershowitz is employed, gainfully employed, you know, by Harvard and by whatever criminal he's defending, whether it's O.J. Simpson or Jeffrey Epstein, right, or whatever. And Norman Finkelstein has been like his arch nemesis in the positive sense. Like, Norman Finkelstein is a brilliant scholar, you know, pro Palestine, you know, and this is one of the most sort of hotbed complex issues in the world, right? The Israel-Palestine conflict has been going on forever. And over a decade ago, I did an analysis of the debate between the two guys, and it was just so asymmetrical, you know, like Dershowitz has a lot of power, and Finkelstein is actually, lost his tenured position and is kind of maligned as a public intellectual. And so it's a disgrace to the whole concept of free speech and fair debate. And, so, I don't think Dershowitz is on the letter, but there's all these other hypocrites like Barry Weiss, for example. And it's like, what are we doing? Like, you're not going to see Finkelstein's name on there, A, because he's not invited, and B, he'd probably protest the kind of hypocrisy of it. And so, if there's any sincerity to that whole letter project and things like it, we need to really level the playing field of public discourse, and of course take money out of politics and all these things.
Well, on the face of it, there's not much to disagree with in the letter, which is like a very standard move. You're like, who's really against the free exchange of ideas?
Yeah.
Maybe a few people, but it's not a general problem that people don't say that they value free speech and open debate. People do always say that. Now, whether they can embody it is a different story, but it certainly doesn't do anything to help the situation forward to have a group of people sign a letter saying that in general, we'd like people to be able to openly talk about things. That's not a powerful or profound move. It would be better if, the Harper's organization sat down and confronted their own tendency to reject information and points of view that they dislike or that challenge their infrastructure. One of the things I really notice is it homogenizes the notion of free speech against the enemy of free speech. It doesn't talk about different forms of free speech that might have different significances. Like, that's the ideal. You want to get to a level of critique where there's a multiplicity, an interactive multiplicity of interpretations between the value we're talking about, and not just a generalized value that people, yes, I've heard of that value, and in general, it sounds like the right thing to do. Okay, that's almost always part of a system that's fuzzing out its critiques in order to maintain its operating procedures. And one of those things, it gets back to this Dershowitz thing, because, Dershowitz can feel like he's being unjustly attacked, right? And yes, some people do get canceled when there's corporations kicking down at them. Then it's a real problem. But people with huge power and huge platforms co-opt that critique, and they do it in order to maintain and amplify their power structure. There's always been cancel culture. I'd argue it's probably a standard part of liberal modernity. I'm rewatching Mad Men, the series, right? Those corporations, they're censoring and threatening and firing major players who aren't publicly on the messaging that the company wants to go out with. So that's not a new thing, right? There might be an assimilation of some postmodern talking points as part of the new way some bureaucratic corporations enforce their control. But they've been firing people for making public statements that isn't the corporate messaging the entire time. That's the cancel culture. It's operating out of the mainstream industrial bureaucratic system that we've had in place for centuries now. And it does it in a way where now they can act like they're the victims, but I don't think that's really a big shift, because I think in integral terms, orange has always co-opted amber's co-opting of red, if that makes sense. Like, nationalism comes in a way where it's meta-tribal. It's got to subdue and keep the tribes subdued. And the tribes are all rebellious, and essentially one tribe has taken over. So you have to say to the rebellious tribes that want to constantly reassert themselves in the face of the ethnocentric homogeneity, listen, we get it, and that's why you should be on side. So your rebellion is the key to our conformism. If you really want to rebel, conform. And then businesses can take that very thing over and just deploy it in every direction. Not to ramble too long, but this came to me. I was a kid. I was at a Starbucks, and there's a big sign. It said, "Who says mocha can't have a summer sidekick?" And I was looking at that sign. It felt weird. After a while, I was like, you know what? Nobody says that. It's not an act of rebellion for me to buy your new summer drink. I'm not getting back at those people who want to insist on a homogeneity. The homogeneity is something you're weaponizing by trying to make me feel like I'm a rebel, right? As if
Yeah.
the people on top are always keeping themselves on top, whether it's cultural or economic, by making you think that supporting them is an act of rebellion against some minor phenomenon.
Yeah, makes me think of a couple things. One is just quickly this idea of proportionality, which I always like to come back to. It's like the difference between like somebody getting their leg amputated or what, you know, whatever, and you know these bourgeois intellectuals. It's like they have a mosquito bite and they act like it's the same thing. Like, oh, I've been canceled. Um, yeah, the other is language, I guess, like just, you know, how it undermines ourselves because we inherit the language of other people, and in different situations of power, you know, we're compelled to use that language. And so that's what's so dangerous about letting certain people, or even just letting, you know, a leaderless discourse set the tone, right? So these terms like cancel culture comes up, and then we debate cancel culture, but it's already set up to fail because we've got those terms, and it's kind of a new meme, but it's a very leaky abstraction, you know. And with all language, and particularly these issues, you know, there's you know, different ways to see them, right? It becomes one of those I forget what's the word for these kind of these illusions, you know, like what color is this dress, or like Laurel versus Yanny, right? Like you can kind of see both or hear both, you know, or one or the other, depending on what your mind is attuned to in that moment. And you know, I found it interesting to actually look at those thought experiments and actually um, you know, a little bit take control of your brain, and you can actually see both, right? You can switch back and forth, or you can kind of see both at the same time. And so it's an interesting kind of phenomenological um, experience of it. So, you know, this is what we continue to be trapped by. There's this presumption of language of being, you know, kind of true on the surface of it, um and of course that's not the case. So when things split into two sides or multiple sides, and particularly with free speech issues, you have people saying like, oh, I'm just speaking the truth. Like, you know, I don't, or even like it could be hypothetical, like I don't want to lose my job for speaking the truth. So there's this presumption built in that they are speaking the truth, but they're not. You know, it's like it might be ambiguous in that moment, or in that, on that platform with that audience, but historically the real people who are getting, you know, canceled, killed, and oppressed are typically speaking truth to power, right? That's what that comes back to, this intellectual versus anti-intellectual divide. So, you know, eventually history bears out, you know, who was speaking the truth and who wasn't. But in the moment it's always difficult, and we can have these regressions where far right wingers can continue to have huge platforms and spin what they're saying to be true within a very narrow context, and to, you know, disproportionately pit that against a straw man they construct of the left or the liberals.
There, there's a way in which both sides of the issue have a higher and a lower form, right? There's a higher form of being empathic and taking critical cultural awareness seriously. And there's a higher form of advocating for free speech, right? Which is to say that, you know, in what I would call a hypersemantic environment, that where we receive so many socially significant signals or potentially significant signals so often that our brains never evolved for this. Our ancestors were not prepared to see 10,000 potentially hyper meaningful cultural artifacts a day. So we are in a situation of overload that we really have to deal with by taking some kind of self-control over how we respond to signifiers. right? It's not okay anymore to assume you know what things mean or assume that your immediate affect is the appropriate response. And so when people make an argument saying that in my terms, safe spaces have to be safe for tongues as well as ears, right? That yes, you have to take other people into consideration, but it has to be safe for people to say things, which means that the listeners have to be prepared to not immediately believe in their response pattern. So that's all. There's those two sides, but there's two lower versions of that as well, right? There's nonsense, fragility, reactivity being protected, and there's nonsense protection of entrenched power structures masquerading as free speech. So it's not so much pitting these against each other and finding a side. It's about seeing both of them and then asking what's the better version of each.
Yeah. And yeah, towards the end of my article, I talk about autocritique, right? And in the context of cancel culture, that would be like canceling yourself. And I'm a huge advocate of this. If people would just cancel themselves where appropriate, we'd be a lot better off. And then that person can also make the best argument. We don't need to stay in the ugly trenches. And another thing that came to mind, I meant to add before, but it's still relevant here, is the lack of mediation, right? So the presumption of a lot of these public intellectuals, like David Brooks, I always like to go back to him because he's such a prominent New York Times pundit, who's notoriously wrong about things and just very opinionated. Like, he like many other intellectuals, whether liberal or conservative, find a way to justify whatever their position is, because there's essentially unlimited evidence, right, to buttress your position. But so David Brooks has a show, Shields and Brooks on PBS, and PBS, public broadcasting system. That's another institution that has really slid to the right, just become kind of radicalized in the worst way rather than serving the public. And so the point that I'm getting at is, there's this presumption that just having these two guys talk, and they're not really talking with any depth, they're just sharing their very superficial reactions to what's going on and making it sound very intellectual, to be sure. It would be great to see them, be mediated, have a guest host, defer to a critic, conduct some social experiments here, because we otherwise we just get the same old nonsense. And it's precisely people like David Brooks who can continue to survive attempts at canceling. He just retains his power, and it's just so infuriating. So that's why I'd love to see more mediation, more moderation of debates, in much more advanced forms. We're just not seeing it. And so, this meta perspective that is emergent, it's still fledgling. There's contention within it. And, as a form of autocritique and, let's say, shadow work as a parallel, right? I'm trying to get ahead of the curve and critique us as we're emerging. So I critique Integral, I critique the intellectual dark web, critique Game B, critique Emerge, which I'm a part of, and I critique myself. My own work has been shaped by this idea of auto critique and of metamodernism for a long time. Like in some senses 10 years, but in other senses a shorter frame, depending on what sort of concept we're working with. So with all that said, I'm still trying to catch up to myself and articulate these things that can actually make an intervention in the culture war or different communities, because it's necessary to to have an adequate diagnosis and solution of the meta crisis and go from post-truth to paradigm shift.
Our structures need to have a lot more integrity than they currently have, flexibility and integrity. And so autocritique is a huge part of that. And in some ways, that's what's so unsatisfying about the situation around the Harper letter, is there's really no autocritique. Where is Harper's in this, right? Is Harper's just being like patting itself on the back for being an advocate of free speech, or is it really open to criticisms from people, even people within itself, about what it happens to be doing? Where's the reckoning? That would be interesting. Them affirming centuries old public ideals against a potentially real but often quite hypothetical adversary, that's not very interesting and isn't going to do anything. I think of, some people trace modern science back to a play that Galileo wrote that I find really interesting. He mostly wrote plays.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Play, there's always like a guy who represents his point of view and a guy who represents the previous scientific view, and then like a random stranger who listens to them both. But anyway, he goes to see a construction site where guys are working on a pillar, and they thought they could brace this pillar at both ends, and they worried about the weight, so they put a pillar to brace it in the middle, a little one, and then it broke. And they thought they were going to add extra support, but it ended up breaking it. And Galileo says, that's where you learn something, right? It's where your guess was incorrect. That's the only time you have the opportunity to become a wiser being. And that's kind of the root of the principle of hypothesis and experimentation in science. But it's so hard for any of us to take it seriously in any area of our life, to be most interested in the area where it looks like our guess might have been incorrect. That requires a huge self-reckoning and autocritique.
Yeah, it relates back to that idea of heuristics, and I make a clear point in the article, like heuristics maybe shouldn't be thought of as inherently bad, which is kind of what Steve Fuller is arguing, because they're mental shortcuts. But by and large, if you rely on them, and if your consciousness is like just an aggregation of these heuristics, and I really think, just to tie back to some of my critiques, obviously Jordan Peterson is a deeply flawed public intellectual and quite reactionary in his politics, but nobody screams heuristic thinking more to me than Jordan Hall. He's got all these catchphrases, many of which he just made up, some of which he, kind of, consciously pirated from places like right-wing subreddits, like the Blue Church Red Religion thing. But these are heuristics. They're mental shortcuts, and they're vicious abstractions, in the sense that they leave out a lot of information. He's trying to make a synthesis, and he'll talk about these things like rule omega and right relation, and it's just, I hate to see, just on the surface of it, those things break down and those rules be violated. And of course, if I do the same thing, I want it to be pointed out. But there's this question of proportionality again, where he'll just, disagree with whatever I'm saying, and then act like that in itself is a valid argument, right? And by the same token, he'll deny whatever the critique is, right? So it just becomes, there's no channel for critique. Like, it's a very narrow band for people like that are very defensive to thread the needle, right? And it's like, so instead of distributing their collective intelligence, they're actually trying to, they're saying that they're doing that, but they're actually trying to maintain authority over it, and maintain some sort of leadership, which they have no credible claim to, in part because their thinking is so reductionist to heuristics. And to go even a rung lower, to a person who's perhaps more popular, is Tim Ferriss, right? Like, look at Tim Ferriss and all the things he does. It's like, he's got this book, Tribe of Mentors, and it's just this thick tome that is just like interviews with these great thinkers, and it's like, well, good for you, but it's extremely it's wide in terms of complexity, but it's extremely shallow, and it doesn't, there's definitely no autocritique in there. It's a bunch of mantras and stuff that make people feel smart. But the real intellectual tradition is so much more complex than that. It's so much more historically rooted and so much more spiritual, you know. And so this is something that needs to be retraced through research. You know, these people that think they're so smart need to keep learning and go back through this and learn what it actually means to be a rebel, like you said earlier, or a critic, and not to just pander and not to dilute your message, because there's all sorts of anti-intellectualism at play.
It seems to me that real intellectualism needs to figure out how to work with the conscious and unconscious intellect simultaneously and bring them together, because falling too hard on either one of them puts you at a disadvantage. Like, I like a lot of Jordan's stuff, and one of the things that it does well is provide you with evocative concepts, regardless of where he gets them, that make you feel like, oh, maybe there's something there, right? And that can go two ways. You're at a bifurcation point when you have that feeling. And one way you could go is just to start using that as if it is already a piece of intelligence. But the other way you can go is, that feeling that I have indicates that I may know something about this that I don't know how to say to myself or someone else. And I think that's one of the less objectionable things about Jordan Peterson, is his advocacy of mythology. Now, mythology has problematic dimensions, but I think what he means is analyzing mythology, which he spends a bunch of his time doing. And I think there are heuristic pieces of information that we've inherited, subconscious capacities to know things, that give us a potential, but we have to enact that potential by working with those feelings. It's great to have instinctive heuristics, but the pre-rational mode of trying to defend a heuristic might have been the most appropriate thing if you couldn't think anything else, right? If we just have an algorithm for behavior and we've survived, then we should double down on that algorithm for behavior, not knowing anything else. Okay, that's a historical thing for the human animal. But if you're at a point where you have the capacity to do analytic critique, then you have to weave that together with those heuristics, right? What you want is for your heuristics to get smarter, right? You don't want to side just with conscious social knowledge or with instincts. You want your instincts to get smarter and your social critique to get smarter, and for them to spiral together somehow. So that's a big work, and most people err more on one side than the other. But I think we need both of that converging in order to get any real intellectual power that can be embodied.
Yeah, and I along those lines, I suppose I could say I'm for heuristics up until the point that they stand in the way of mutual intellectual progress or discourse, right? And this comes back to the people that I've had conflicts with and that end up blocking. So in these cases, it's not even intellectual heuristics that are getting in the way. It's emotional heuristics and conversational heuristics, where they say, well, they think or they say, like, well, no, you can't talk this way, or, you know, my position is valid, that this is a 50-50 exchange, and you know, or I'm just going to block you as the solution, you know, and not even worry about the downstream effects of that, right? And, you know, it comes back to this idea of autocritique too. Like, if people were autocritical, they would have anticipated that I was going to follow up with critiques, and that it would like they didn't solve the problem by following their heuristic, right? So that's part of what I'm trying to do, even if I'm like partly in the wrong. I want to debunk other people's heuristics, to say, like, no, you don't control how it works just by repeating some phrase, even if it's functional most of the time, right? So intellectual progress really is about breaking those habits and assumptions, but not just endless deconstruction, right? This is why we aspire to metamodernism. It's that we have attractors in the future and beyond our cognitive capacity in the moment that are guiding us. So, you know, kind of a little bit faith driven, but also it's a very intellectual practice, and behind it, of course, there's a willingness to be wrong. I think I'm more willing to be wrong than other people, and it's like I'm inviting that debunk. You know, if you have a criticism, or a debunk, like by all means share it. And I'm not gonna tone police you, but it better fucking be true, whatever you're trying to critique, right? And so when it goes the other way, I'm willing to stand by my critique, right? And I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to be disproven. But too many people think they're above reproach. And from going back to the letter, of course, Chomsky stands out as one of the few people who is not a hypocrite. I think like he'll actually talk to people, and he'll, I suppose, change his positions if he's proven wrong. Whereas others, I think, don't even deserve to be invited to that list. They're just so controversial in the worst way. It's really their egos are literally standing in the way of collective progress.
From the point of view of the people setting up the letter, right? You might feel that they want to have, or ought to want to have, more authenticity and consistency among the contributories to the signatures. But after the fact, you get a lot of these weird effects, these sort of, bad part of the French Revolution effects, where you want to say, well, you signed your name to a list and there's terrible people on that list. So aren't you therefore terrible?
Right.
All right. There's a difference between positions, right? One position is somebody's just asked do you agree with these general principles of free speech? Sure, I do. Right. And then all of a sudden you find yourself on a list with all these other people. And then it would be really unpleasant and immoral downstream from that for someone to say, well, I think you should probably be censured or lose your job because you're no better than those people if you're on that list with them. So, right, it's not really the responsibility of the signatory, and they shouldn't suffer the consequences. It's the responsibility of the person who sets it up to have that kind of ethically consistent analysis as best they can in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. And, one of the controversial people that comes to mind, especially of the past weeks, is J.K. Rowling, right? Like why is she on there? And so, she's controversial for kind of being anti-trans in the sense that, she keeps making the claim that, trans women aren't women. And so this pisses off a lot of people, rightly so. And so it begs the question, right? Like, okay, if this letter and these signatories are sincere, then shouldn't, like, in this context, shouldn't there be some reconciliation around that topic, right? So, if I was to be generous in the interpretation of J.K. Rowling, I would say that, well, she just lacks the rhetorical sensibility to frame this issue correctly, right? She's not actually a bigot, but it's a language problem because these people are refusing to actually reconcile the discourse. They just want to have their right to say what they want to say, whether it's coherent or not. And so that gets to the crux of the problem. It's like, there's many reasons to react to this letter, but the question that it begs is, okay, if you're all for free speech, then what can we actually do about it? What options are you giving us to remediate this situation, to actually educate some of the signatories? And when I say educate, I don't mean like sensitivity training. I mean, like, let's all get collectively educated, sort of through a common discourse that frames these things in a less controversial way, right? We can de-escalate and depolarize the discourse itself by each of those people and ourselves subjecting ourselves to an autocritique, so that we actually can learn how to rephrase whatever it is we're trying to say in a way that not just offends less people, but in a way that's more true.
Yeah, there's a big tendency to conflate sensitivity and performed empathy with emotional intelligence. And that really limits what emotional intelligence ought to mean. And it's a very convenient kind of definition because it allows the idea of emotional intelligence and the idea of being more sensitive to people to be very easily co-opted by the standard kind of administrative, corporate, bureaucratic, organizational structures that have dominated in the modern period. And it allows them to, they have a tremendous ability to co-opt values rhetoric from all sides, right? If you just look at the sort of status quo setup of the American legislature and how it's automatically tends to divide into what I would call, centrists who want to use progressive rhetoric and centrists who want to co-opt traditional rhetoric. And then they maintain the ball between those two players by acting like it's two fundamentally different worldviews arguing about control, when really it's one worldview maintaining control by co-opting the values rhetoric of two other groups. And that's a hugely problematic thing. And the modern structure, for all the advantages it's given us, is currently somewhat degenerate and definitely putting a limitation on the amount of qualitative improvement we can have in our civilization. And it holds itself in place amazingly well. It's fundamentally very adaptive because it can pick up any set of ideas and start deploying them back to the public as a marketing system. But it's also very metastable because it uses this oppositional approach. It's always got two sides that appear to be opposite, and you have to pick one of those two sides to be on. Even the whole cancel culture is the flip side of the insulation of people from public feedback for their decisions, right? So many people who in politics, in business, in pontification, they get things wrong constantly and suffer no ill effects. They're completely insulated. And in the market, that counts as having attained some merit. You've insulated yourself from feedback. Now, cancel culture is the flip side of that. They want to be able to take people down, supposedly. But it's such a perfect inverse that you have to imagine it's part of one system. They're reciprocally stabilizing each other.
Yeah, exactly. And you know I'm triggered by this both sides concept, but everything you said is absolutely true. And at best, this is what Bonita Roy and Jonathan Rowson mean when they say both sides. But I maintain that they're committing a mistake, or they're refusing or failing to articulate a higher third position to actually make that claim, right? And so this is why I'm advocating for, outside of that both sides, a consolidation and convergence of the alternative that's emerging, right? Because if it's just hyperpluralist, then it's postmodern all over again, right? So people really underestimate the importance and the possibility of convergence and of consensus, which doesn't exclude diversity, right? But it's like the puzzle pieces, the puzzle actually being complete, right? We have to complete that puzzle. And it's like as I say in my my consensus article, you can think of it like a jigsaw puzzle, but Sana Rodelius gave me this idea of the was jig whatever, like the reverse of a jigsaw puzzle. The concept is you don't know what the picture looks like, right? Or it's like it doesn't have a picture, but nevertheless there's a way that the pieces fit together, and you have to kind of figure that out collectively. So this comes back to the autocritique idea too. Like, everybody has to do it, and so this, when you read about just to go prior to the letter thing, when you read about the New York Times controversy about publishing that Tom Cotton op-ed, and then there's all the kind of discussion about, there's this internal battle at the New York Times, and then James Bennett resigns. But actually within that little bubble, there's a both sides thing happening where they're both wrong, and there's no it's a kind of performative kind of internal battle, and it's all, I can just picture it all being dramatic, and they're still not getting any of the leftist critique. They're not letting any of it in, which is like the real substantive stuff, like anti-war, like just having a well-informed critical position on the major issues like the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? Like these things are all still taboo, and they shouldn't be taboo. My view is that they effectively get solved time and time again, but then that solution gets repressed by maintaining the status quo. So the cycle repeats itself again and again and again. And like, I used to use the phrase "the war on drugs" a lot. That we have to end the war on drugs, and I would use that phrase because the war on drugs is still happening. But it's a kind of antiquated term, right? But it's like, okay, but it's still happening, in the United States, like Biden doesn't want to legalize weed. Like this is just so ancient idiotic thinking, counter evidence. And like the more time we waste on these types of issues that have already been solved effectively, the worse off we are, right? It just compounds the problems that we're facing. And so coming back to this overdetermination idea, right? We need to get away from that.
Yeah, there's a real reluctance to accept that there are answers. And that doesn't mean that there's a single right answer. It does mean that there might be a best fit answer among the given possibilities in any context, and that we should get behind the answers that we can mobilize on. Right? It's a very, although intellectuals throughout history do need to be able to sit back and consider other options and not be bound by the implied context of what they're looking at, there's a tendency to do that in a really insipid way, which never comes to any conclusion. It just always thinks there's maybe some better conclusion out there that isn't represented by anyone, and they never seem to get to it. It's very often an excuse not to get involved in very good solutions that have been around for a long time by the people who have looked at the problem time and again. It makes me think of being at university and dealing with philosophy professors who that I ended up calling philosophers because they didn't seem to be interested in any wisdom. They were just interested in telling you about all the different things other people have said about wisdom. And I thought we'd always think, like, why isn't it more like the history of science? Didn't some of these people figure something out?
Right.
No, this was his opinion, and then this was his opinion, and then this was her opinion. And it's not just that they believe in a hyper-pluralistic, ambiguous universe. It's that they take a perverse satisfaction in not having to commit to any of the positions. It gives them a tremendous security, but they're not free from commitments in that security. They're committed to all the things that they're embedded in. They're committed to a very specific set of ideas and procedures, and they maintain that by saying, well, look, who can know about all the other options of procedures and commitments?
Yeah.
It's very slippery.
Yeah. And, you raise a key word there, wisdom, which is salient because that's a big, I don't want to say talking point, but it's a big research interest of John Vervaeke, right? He's very passionate about that. And he's very, enlightened on the subject. But I also have critiques for him, because he's trying to build out an awareness of this topic, but he, whether consciously or unconsciously, stops short of advocating what wise positions are. And I think there's a lot out there, and so I'm gonna talk to him soon and gonna be trying to challenge him on that, trying to tease out some of that active wisdom, because we don't have time to mess around. And as brilliant as he is, like there's a heuristic, to go back to that concept. I shared this heuristic with him once, and it's, of course, again, heuristics are flawed, but in this case, it's the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid. And there's different variations on it, and I think it's a really well integrated model of what wisdom's relation is to everything else. And when I shared it with him, he wasn't actually aware of it. And so, I mean, that doesn't mean he's not wise and very deeply researched. But I thought this was a good heuristic, especially when you're trying to, simplify and teach this subject to other people. That's a good heuristic to take with you, to just keep in mind that when you think about wisdom, like there's a correlation and a causal relationship with the knowledge that you have, and that's predicated on how the information is structured, and then that goes deeper to the data itself, which as we all sense in some way now is infinite, right? We have access to almost everything that's ever been written, and philosophers in the past didn't have that. So the idea of wisdom transforms itself. It's like, okay, this is beyond me, right? Like, okay, like if I want to be more wise, then I gotta parse all this data. But then also, something I'm trying to suggest and instill through this anti-intellectualism article is that you got to have a moral compass. You got to be materially grounded. You got to be historically situated, right? And so somewhere in that architecture of wisdom, you have to bring it back to these basics, and think about, how can I help the most people.
Yeah, there's always been an interplay in, let's say, wisdom communities, wisdom lineages, things like that, between, on the one hand, focusing on developmental tactics for individuals or small groups to manifest an intelligence that supersedes and organizes their intelligence. And that's going to be, like I was saying earlier, somewhat conscious and somewhat unconscious, because you're going to get some of it, but you've also got to trust some of it to be smarter than you are. And you want to bring that out, and that can get sabotaged by taking too definite a position on things that are, especially things that are publicly and socially fraught with polarized tension. But on the other hand, wisdom means showing up where you are in the world that you're in, right? It has this compassion ethos. It has this moral driver within it. And it has to be able to find the things that are actionably true in a given part of the universe. So those have often competed with each other, right? And it's important to get that balance correct. The book Zen at War is a very interesting book because it describes how many of the people who were doing wisdom practices in the Zen monasteries just went right into the Japanese fascist imperial war effort. Only a few of them stood back and said, this isn't right.
Right.
Right. But many of them felt like, yeah, there's a very straightforward way for Zen Buddhism to explain why we need to kill the Americans on boats. So there's also, this is what John and I are going to talk about next week. We're going to committed to talk about politics, and it's about how do you once you see how well the wisdom construction mechanics operates, and you say, oh, I've seen it at all these scales of individual and interpersonal development. How do you unpack that into different domains, right? So we thought, well, we'll unpack it into politics, unpack it into art, because it's not just about knowing how wisdom works. It's about applying wisdom to particular domains. And you've only applied it as much as you've taken the time to apply it. So you've got to put the work in to see how it operates in that area, and not pat yourself on the back for being generally wise while uttering superficialities in every other area of life and expecting to get the same credit.
Yeah, all that sounds great. Like it's definitely easy to fall into that, and that is particularly in the self-preservation sense. um and it comes back to an idea I haven't brought up, but it's in my article, is negative responsibility, right? And I'll read the quote. It's from the book The Sociology of Intellectual Life. The quote is, I mean to draw attention to a crucial element in the cultivation and evaluation of intellectuals. Negative responsibility. Negative responsibility belongs to the discourse of utilitarian ethics, whereby one always judges the moral worth of an action in relation to the available alternatives not taken by the agent. The implication is that those with a wider scope for action bear a greater responsibility to do good. a failure to do good when one could have easily done so is tantamount to doing a bad thing. I love that last part of that last part of it, tantamount to doing a bad thing, because that justifies some of my anger and critiques at people who I think could speak up more and do a better thing. And of course, at the end of the day, it's their calculation to make, right? But how are they weighing the odds, right? Because if they don't take the risk, then they don't actually know. And also, there's this idea of which I love, of reckless and feckless intellectuals, right? And Steve Fuller writes, such fecklessness goes unnoticed because it does not leave an evidential trace. It simply consists in the refrain from action. And so this is precisely what, the part of the problem I'm getting at here. And it's like especially when I'm trying to build consensus about, let's say, speaking up about the Israel-Palestine conflict, or for supporting Bernie Sanders, it's like building that consensus would actually make it easier for these people to speak up when they might be in a position like, oh, I don't want to stick my neck out because it's gonna, I'll get critiqued, or it'll undermine my appeal to the most people, right? But they're not, like, provably, they're not making the meta move or the autocritical move to just do the right thing, to think about the big picture and the sort of time crunch we're in, and the kind of epistemic crisis we're in. And they're not doing the thing that they can, which is to use their power and responsibility to speak up for the common person, or for the unsung hero, for the intellectual who is suppressed. They can advocate with, I think, relatively little risk, and it's up to them to figure out how to do that. And like you were saying quite well, nested within this idea of wisdom, you can make all sorts of trade-offs, like, so you're going to sound more wise if you really lean into the paradoxes of life, right? 'Cause, like, life is very paradoxical. So wisdom is in part just acknowledging that uncertainty and that undefinability or ineffability. So that's all well and good, but at the end of the day, it's a kind of pseudo wisdom if you're not, speaking out against slavery or apartheid or genocide or whatever. And just to one last point on that topic, right, to frame it under anti-intellectualism again, those things are always pushed out of the public eye and public discourse as far as possible, right? So it's hard to see. It's really the mandate of the intellectual to go seek out those contradictions and to then, amplify them into the critical discourse.
I think it's the requirement of the intellectual to wrestle with those contradictions, because there's a way of being a very feckless, superficial Taoist, where what you say is, I cognitively recognize the contradictions in all these different affairs, but honestly, they haven't bothered me that much. And I promote that not being bothered as if it was a special status I have where I float above the contradictory and paradoxical nature of reality. But what I don't do then is engage in that crunch, right? And that's also, that crunch is where the moral imperative comes in. And you don't know what that is, because like you're saying, on the one hand, it's absolutely true that you have a moral imperative relative to your other courses of action. But at the same time, you have to figure out whose implied courses of action you don't have to listen to. Because if you just cast a wide net in society, or even in your own family, you just constantly hear from people who seem to be implying that you should take responsibility for something in some vague way. And it may not be the case. It may be just the expression of their egoism or their type or the areas in which they're working on trying to take responsibility. And you don't know. You try to stay open to it, but it's exhausting to stay open to everything. So you've got to put this, it's a rough work to struggle with which courses of more moral action do you not have to worry about? Which ones should you be worrying about? How do you accept the fire of that worry without exhausting yourself? But that's all something that the intellectual should be doing, should be taking responsibility for the risk taking and the weighing and the internal aggravation that's going to be implicit in that procedure.
Yeah. What pops into my head is not conventional intellectuals, but people that have faithfully served the type of functions we're talking about, and that is comedians. A lot of comedians, throughout history have demonstrated incredible intellect and wisdom, and moral fortitude and all that in speaking out, and finding a way to do it that is just cuts through the bullshit. And somebody who is kind of a comedian but not really known for that comes to mind is Muhammad Ali, because he was just so articulate, right? And we have these more typical intellectual heroes like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but the thing about Muhammad Ali that is so impressive, and we have to remember, is that he didn't start out being an intellectual. He was a boxer, and he just, when it came to things like the draft and the Vietnam War, he just clearly did the right thing, and he just spoke up, and not talked down, but like was took the high road, but was also didn't pull his punches, so to speak, in talking. So he would do these press conferences and just go into a kind of poetic flow about how wrong the status quo was, and the things he was asked to participate in, how wrong they were. And so I wanted to make that point, but also a more meta point is that as time goes on, these historical figures get whitewashed and co-opted, and that's part of the tragedy here. Is we can't let that happen. We can't let that happen to ourselves and to each other. So for a real intellectual paradigm shift, we need to keep surfing that liminal threshold where we honor what they were doing. We carry it forward, because like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King have all been, whitewashed and co-opted. So we get a kind of blander version of them and a kind of ahistorical version of them. And the same thing happens with Albert Einstein, who I mentioned in the article. And it's not that he was ever canceled in any way. I mean, he was driven out of Nazi Germany for being an intellectual, but he's remembered primarily for his contributions to science. And I make a point to say that it's anti-intellectual to dismiss his contributions outside his own field, because he happened to be, I think, correct to advocate for socialism, right? And so, that's what it means to be intellectual. It doesn't, it doesn't mean you're a physics genius and all that. It means that you actually are integrated in a very comprehensive way as a full human who doesn't make compromises and doesn't mince words. You obviously have to think and intellectualize these things in order to communicate them, but there's a moral foundation there that is just unimpeachable, and so that's what I'm trying to highlight here in this intellectual tradition.
It's a tricky thing, opining on things outside your field, because on the one hand, it's illegitimate to dismiss that as unimportant and anti-intellectual merely because it's not in the silo you put it in. Because a lot of the stuff we're talking about, and wisdom development, especially where intellect and morality come together, is something that can potentially apply in general to human life. And on the other hand, one of the key integral insights is these sort of different lines of intelligence are a fundamental component of how you look at things, And if you sit around with a guru and he legitimately is awesome at some things, inculcating alternate states of consciousness, transmitting some kind of electrical charge to you, fantastic. Doesn't mean his statements about human relationships and diet have any credibility at all. So on the one hand, we have to tease them apart, but on the other hand, we can't prejudge people just because that's not the territory we initially expected them to be in. And we often don't know the full range of territories or the full details of anything, which is tough because the conversation will always be dominated by people who only have the upfront information. The Einstein for Dummies is going to be the majority of the conversation about Einstein. And one of the reasons that we need to have a political shift in terms of how economy and ecology and health are generated is because it takes time and energy for people to look further into things. You have to be curious. You have to have a functioning body and brain. Then you have to go and intentionally research some things. And then you have to formulate them to yourself. And then you have to do some kind of critique on it. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of energy. That's something that's easily derailed by any kind of pressures and stresses. And it's not like if you just gave everybody a bunch of money, they would all sit around and become super intellectuals. But we have to depressurize the system and incentivize intentional growth and development in a multidimensional sense.
Yeah. And I want to bring it back to sociology and the structure of society and the idea of systems change, because we can't just advocate for this on an individual level. That is fruitless and kind of brain dead kind of trajectory, right? And I rail against it in terms of this this antagonism between psychology and sociology. And I think if we're to build a consensus, I think we already tacitly agree on like things like mass universal education, just full expansion, enfranchisement to everybody. And this is a huge structural upgrade, and it requires a paradigm shift in thinking too. But it's just it's so tragic how obvious this is, and how we've even regressed in some cases, but that we're just stagnating and refusing to make that leap. And like sort of case in point is like critical thinking is not even taught in high school. And this is partly just like partly a strategic kind of interest, part of this anti-intellectualism trend. Different lobbying groups can challenge that and disincentivize it because it undermines religion or whatever. But these are basic things, and you can't, it comes back to this idea of over determining the solution. We can't just say, okay, like we're going to teach critical thinking in high school. Yeah, but you need to expand high school to everybody, right? Like the illiteracy rates and the dropout rates in the United States are embarrassing. And this is not an individual failure. It's a structural failure. So, we need to start agreeing on those systems change principles that are interlocking, right? So we need to universalize access to education, which means like more economic empowerment, right? Which necessarily means like a UBI and jobs guarantee and minimum wage, all these things in a meshwork together. And then, yeah, we need to add critical thinking to the curriculum, right? And these are the levers, kind of Archimedean levers, really, that especially in tandem, in conjunction, will enable us to achieve all these values that people give lip service to, whether it's justice or free speech or whatever. It's all just becoming a joke because, in the most meta sense of anti-intellectualism, as I start off with towards the beginning of my article, it's like climate change denial has been a systematic process for over a century. We've known about it for over a century. And so what is happening in the kind of system level when we let those absolute provisional but absolute truths just fall by the wayside, right? I think just tackling the problem head on with Green New Deals galore, and universal health care, and all these interlocking structural upgrades will be a windfall for people, right? It's not like the elites are going to suffer by enabling these things, and the more people who enact it, to use that word again, the easier it gets.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be, there's not going to be an increase of suffering on the part of elites. The tension against it is fundamentally the tension of one control system's attractor trying to maintain itself, and it does that through the individuals. This interlocking set of system upgrades the whole point is to increase, on the one hand, general human well-being and opportunity for development, and on the other hand, I would argue, preparation for inevitable, accumulating, problematic, and surprising things that are coming down the pipeline towards us. Right? The way the Americans have handled this current situation, the way some of the other countries have, not like everybody's done an amazing job except for America and Brazil or something, but there's been an exposure of systemic weaknesses that are built into this system, in the same way that people always used to say, well, the market can't prepare for an asteroid, right? Because it doesn't immediately impact anybody, and so it won't show up in their purchasing habits or their investment habits. It's the same kind of thing with climate change. It's the same kind of thing with the next pandemic. It's the same, right? There's going to be black swans and things that aren't black swans that are totally predictable, and we see them building up, and they're going to hit us. And these systems, these interlocking system upgrades, aren't just to be nice and give more things to people who currently exist. They're to create a system that can survive shocks and turbulence, that can, depressurize, run things down, that can trip switches that don't just benefit a few investors or banks, but which distribute well-being to the system so that it can be stable when it gets hit. And if you don't have health, if you don't have education, if you don't have some kind of economic support so you can click out of your job and maintain things, then the system is going to crumple and collapse and tear apart every time it gets hit, and it's going to get hit. One of the fundamental pieces of progressive insight is to look across multiple cycles. We're not interested just in this quarter's profits. We're not interested in this election cycle. We're interested in what's been trending across those cycles and how you prepare for what's definitely coming down the pipeline at us.
Yeah, the idea of black swans is interesting, but additionally, something Vinay Gupta and I talked about was black elephants, which is like something that everybody knows is a problem but doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah, I saw Taleb was asked about the coronavirus several times as if it was a black swan. And he's like, it's not a black swan. It's totally predictable.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe it's a black elephant. And
Yeah.
I'd never heard this phrase. It's not as popular as black swan, but it sounds like that's what Taleb is hinting at too. And yeah, so we want to break these taboos, and yeah, I don't know. I get really exhausted because just it's mind numbing sometimes, the mental gymnastics we do, whether it's like like demonstrably idiotic people, or even like ostensibly really educated people. We're all doing this kind of mental gymnastics to like problematize in a way that denies certain things, or blinds ourselves to our own role in it. So I think what you and I are trying to do is just communicate and hang out in that liminal space, and try to push the threshold, and widen the Overton window, or pick your metaphor, but we're trying to keep a higher provisional truth alive, right, which involves a lot of these very very obvious things when you look at them.
Yeah, I think it is anti-intellectual to problematize and to treat as radical and ambiguous some basic system upgrades that are obviously not the solution to every problem, but put us all in a better position to move forward on solving our problems. Well, I think we got to be at the end here. I got to prep for another talk in 40 minutes that I haven't done any research on yet.
Sounds good. Yeah, this one's a little shorter, but I think it's for the better because it's very dense, and maybe we're both spent.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to metanoia in connection with anti-intellectualism. It would be great to go into education at some point.
Yeah,
That's a piece of this. But also, like I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I think not just voting procedures, but collective intelligence protocols. That's a big topic. But what do we actually perform with each other in order to make sense of things in terms of our social rules about enacting change? Because in some ways, getting through upgrades in the system depends on how the current system makes its decisions. And those are dumber or less dumb. So it keys into the anti-intellectualism thing there, right? Is there a less intellectual way of voting and a more intellectual way of voting? Huge topic, but I'd like to get into it at some point.
yeah. Yeah, thanks again. And if anybody's listening to this, like, share, subscribe, and comment. Help us out and help yourself by leveling up and participating in this discourse. Good luck and good night.
I've been keeping my mouth shut as much as I can so that maybe YouTube will provide it as an option.